What it was like to live with Victorian social rules? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a world of lace gloves, rigid etiquette, and emotional repression so dense you could spread it on toast. We're going to Victorian Britain, the land of polite misery. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's wander slowly through gaslit streets, through parlors that smell faintly of coal smoke and lavender, through a society obsessed with manners, appearances, and pretending that everything, absolutely everything, was fine. Because in Victorian England, what mattered most wasn't happiness or love or honesty. It was propriety. And propriety, as it turns out, was exhausting. The Victorian era lasted from 1837 to 1901, the long reign of Queen Victoria. 64 years of progress, expansion, and deeply repressed feelings. It was a time when the British Empire spanned the globe, when trains thundered across the countryside, and when electricity and telegraphs were changing how people lived. It was also a time when women fainted for sport, men wore more layers than an onion, and dinner parties were emotional minefields. If you lived in Victorian Britain, you lived inside an invisible cage of rules. Rules for how to walk, talk, dress, eat, write letters, breathe, grieve, and exist in public without accidentally ruining your family forever. The Victorians believed civilization was fragile, a thin veneer separating them from chaos. So they built their world out of rituals and politeness, layer upon layer of behavior meant to keep everything tidy and controlled. It worked, sort of. Let's start with class, because the Victorians never started a conversation without figuring out where you stood in it. Society was divided into three broad categories: the upper class, the middle class, and the working class. But in practice, there were about 70 unofficial sub-tiers. A duke could talk to a marquis, but not to a baronet unless absolutely necessary. A wealthy industrialist might have more money than half the aristocracy, but was still regarded as trade, which was the social equivalent of being mildly contagious. Even the middle class divided itself with surgical precision. There were respectable middle-class people, and then there were those who were only middling. And then there were the aspiring, the genteel, the nearly respectable, the comfortably retired, and the rather nice but unfortunate. Everyone knew exactly where everyone else stood, and God help you if you forgot your place. For women, the social ladder was even slipperier. My use. Victorian lady's reputation was her entire existence, and it could be destroyed faster than you could drop a handkerchief in the wrong direction. If a man stared too long at you in a park, or if your ankle was seen emerging from beneath your skirt, your name could end up on everyone's lips, and not in a good way. That's why women carried fans, not just for cooling themselves, but as defensive tools in the unending game of social signaling. A fan held high meant indifference. Tree, fan fluttered slowly, meant flirtation. A fan dropped on purpose was scandal. and heaven forbid a man picked it up. Victorian clothing, meanwhile, was less fashion and more fortification. Women's dresses were elaborate constructions of whalebone, steel, silk, and prayer. Corsets cinched the waist until breathing became a part-time activity, skirts ballooned outward with crinolines so wide they could knock over furniture, and occasionally did. There are records of women dying when their dresses caught fire from open hearths. The fabric burned fast, and the poor things couldn't move in time. Of course, propriety demanded that a lady never raise her voice, even while on fire, so one assumes the scene was very dignified. Men, meanwhile, wore enough layers to smother a horse. A respectable gentleman went out in waistcoat, cravat, coat, hat, gloves, and often a cloak, even in summer, especially in summer, because sweat was undignified. Dying of heat stroke, however, was perfectly acceptable. Now, the Victorians didn't just care about how you looked. They cared about how you behaved. Every social interaction came with an invisible script, and failing to follow, it could end your prospects faster than tuberculosis. You didn't shake hands with someone of higher rank unless they offered first. You didn't sit down before a lady did, or, heaven forbid, speak to her before being introduced. Even conversation had rules. Never talk about money. Never talk about politics. Never talk about religion. And never, under any circumstances, talk about how you actually feel. The ideal Victorian was calm, courteous, and emotionally dead inside. Let's drift into a typical drawing room, where the furniture looks uncomfortable on purpose. Tea is being served. Someone is playing a hesitant tune on the piano. The host smiles thinly, pretending not to hate everyone present. In this delicate environment, every gesture matters. A misplaced teacup? Social death? Mentioning digestion? Barbaric. Laughing too loudly. Unthinkable. If you were a guest, your job was to be charming, restrained, and, above all, harmless. If you had opinions, keep them. If you had emotions, bury them. And if you had a scandal in the family, never speak of it. It was an age that prized silence dressed as virtue. Of course, underneath the surface, the Victorians were just as messy as anyone else. They just hid it better. For every respectable gentleman reading poetry in his study, there was another one sneaking into the poorer parts of town for activities not fit for the vicar's newsletter. And for every pious lady arranging flowers for charity, there was another downing laudanum, a fashionable mixture of alcohol and opium to get through the day. If you couldn't afford drugs, you had hysteria instead. It was practically a lifestyle. Doctors diagnosed hysteria in women who suffered from fatigue, sadness, restlessness, or, frankly, being alive in the 19th century. Treatments included cold baths, isolation, and occasionally marriage, because apparently a husband was considered an all-purpose cure. It rarely worked. One of the most confusing parts of Victorian life was courtship. The delicate ritual of trying to find a spouse without ever admitting you wanted one. You couldn't simply walk up to someone and say, "I like you." You had to arrange it through a dizzying dance of glances, letters, chaperones, and misunderstandings. A man could only visit a lady if her mother was present. He could write letters, but they had to be formal. He could offer flowers, but each type of flower had a meaning, and sending the wrong one could end everything. A red rose meant love. A yellow rose meant friendship. A black rose meant you'd probably been reading too much Byron. There was even a guidebook called The Language of Flowers, which helpfully turned romance into a botanical code, because nothing says passion like needing a glossary. Once married, the rules didn't get easier. They just changed. Husbands were expected to be providers, moral examples, and the undisputed masters of the household. Wives were expected to be silent, graceful, and endlessly patient, which is to say, saints with good posture. Marital affection was to be expressed with moderation. Too much was vulgar. Too little was tragedy. And while men could discreetly visit mistresses, women were supposed to smile, pour the tea, and quietly develop a nervous condition. Let's drift out of the drawing rooms and into the streets, because the rules followed you everywhere. Even in public, there were endless expectations. If you were walking alone, you had to mind your posture, your speed, your expression. Smiling too openly made you look common. Staring made you rude. Talking to strangers made you dangerous, and if you were a woman, walking alone at all was enough to raise eyebrows. Ladies were supposed to have escorts, ideally male, but at least someone respectable enough to imply they weren't available. Public parks were divided by class. So were trains, shops, and even church pews. London might have been the heart of an empire, but it was also a living diagram of hierarchy. Everyone had a place, and everyone was watching. Victorian morality extended to death itself, because, naturally, even dying came with rules. When someone passed away, the mourning process was a social event. Black clothing was mandatory. A widow wore it for 2 years. After that, she could switch to gray or lavender, assuming she hadn't died of boredom first. Mourning jewelry became a fashion. Lockets containing a loved one's hair, or rings set with jet and onyx. You could even send mourning cards, so everyone knew you were appropriately devastated. Grief, like everything else, had to be dignified and well-dressed. And yet, beneath all this suffocating decorum, something else was happening. Industrialization, urbanization, the rise of the middle class. Millions of people were leaving farms for factories, moving into cities that grew faster than anyone could manage. Life became dirtier, busier, noisier, and the old rules began to crack under the pressure. But the Victorians clung to them anyway, like drowning people clutching lace parasols, because if manners failed, what else was left? They believed that morality Even hypocritical morality held the world together. Without it, everything might slide into chaos. And perhaps they were right. Just not in the way they thought. By the end of the 19th century, the cracks in Victorian society were widening. The old ideals of purity and propriety were giving way to cynicism, satire, and science. Darwin had dethroned creation. Freud was poking around in the unconscious, and Oscar Wilde was making polite society deeply uncomfortable. The taste of hunger, hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when hunger wasn't a diet trend, but a season. A time when the fields were both a blessing and a threat. When people prayed for rain, then prayed for it to stop, and when every meal, however small, was a quiet gamble between life and death. Yes, tonight, we're talking about what people actually ate in a medieval famine. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe keep a snack nearby. Though after this, you might rethink it, because famine food was not, shall we say, Michelin-star cuisine. In the Middle Ages, Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, fields, and weather patterns. And those weather patterns were moody. Sometimes the sun vanished for weeks. Sometimes frost came in August. Sometimes the rain simply never stopped. And when that happened, crops failed. And when crops failed, the entire fragile web of medieval life began to unravel. Because there were no supermarkets, no global imports, no safety net beyond the goodwill of your neighbors, who, if we're being honest, were probably just as hungry as you. So, what did people actually eat when there was nothing left to eat? Well, the answer depends on how desperate they were. Because in medieval Europe, famine wasn't one single catastrophe. It was a sliding scale of misery. At first, people tightened their belts and stretched what they had. Then they began to improvise. And finally, they started eating things they really shouldn't have. Let's start at the shallow end of that very unpleasant pool. In a good year, the average peasant diet wasn't bad, just repetitive. Bread, porridge, beer, maybe a little cheese, some beans, or salted fish if you lived near a river. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Then, when a poor harvest came, people made do. They ground up less grain, mixed in whatever they could find. Acorns, chestnuts, peas, beans, or tree bark. Yes, actual tree bark. They peeled it from birch or oak, dried it, pounded it into powder, and blended it with flour. It made what they called famine bread. It looked like bread, sort of. It tasted fibrous, and it was about as nutritious as it sounds. This wasn't entirely a peasant invention either. Nobles and clergy were aware of it. Records from Scandinavia, Germany, and France all mention bark bread as an emergency measure. So when you imagine medieval peasants gnawing on tree trunks, It's not as metaphorical as it sounds, and because we humans are nothing if not committed to bad ideas, famine bread sometimes included things like ground straw, sawdust, or roots. If it could be dried, mashed, or vaguely resembled flour, in it went. Naturally, it wasn't good for you. The indigestible fibers often caused intestinal bleeding or starvation even faster. But when the alternative was nothing, inedible became a relative term. Let's drift to England for a moment, specifically to the early 14th century. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was one of the worst in European history. It started with rain. Endless, cold, miserable rain. For months, fields were too waterlogged to plant or harvest. Cattle drowned in the mud, and grain rotted before it could be threshed. By winter, entire villages were running out of food. And when winter stretched into spring with no improvement, desperation set in. The chroniclers of the time, always so cheerfully understated, wrote that many thousands died of hunger, and that people ate things no man should eat. Which brings us to one of the more famous, if unpleasant, famine foods: horse, dog, or anything that could be chewed. Yes, people ate horses. They also ate dogs, and, in the worst cases, they ate other people. But we'll get to that later, very gently, and preferably not right before you fall asleep. For now, let's stay in the middle ground, the edible but regrettable. When food ran low, people scavenged. They turned to wild plants, nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves. In some places, these became a kind of unofficial peasant salad, though less by choice than by necessity. They also ate roots, not your friendly supermarket carrots, but wild ones, woody, bitter, and often half-poisonous. In fact, a lot of famine foods had the fun side effect of either causing hallucinations or mild death. One chronicler from France mentions peasants eating the roots of arum, a plant that causes blistering of the mouth and throat. Another describes villagers boiling thistles into soup, and several accounts mention earth bread, which was exactly what it sounds like. They mixed clay or chalk with water, shaped it into loaves, and baked it. It filled the stomach. It also probably shaved years off your life expectancy. Now, let's drift into something a little darker. Not horrific, just sad in a strangely practical way. When famine came, one of the first things people did was kill their livestock. At first, that seems logical. Better to eat the animals than let them starve. But livestock were also the only source of milk, wool, and traction for plows. So when they were gone, recovery became nearly impossible. By the second year of a bad famine, villages often had no animals left at all. No cows, no sheep, no horses, just a few chickens, if they were lucky, or rats, if they weren't. And yes, people ate rats and mice, and occasionally cats. Because hunger isn't choosy, and neither were they. Let's step into the mind of a medieval villager for a moment. Imagine you wake up one morning in early spring. There's nothing left in the storehouse. No grain, no beans, no dried peas. The fields are bare, and you can't plant yet. You've already sold your tools, eaten the chickens, and the dog has mysteriously gone missing. You go into the forest, because it's the only place left to find food. You dig up roots, you pick leaves, you try to remember which ones didn't kill the neighbors last year, and then you come home and make soup. It's not really soup. Of course, it's water, with something vaguely plant-like floating in it. But for a few hours, it tastes like hope. This was famine cooking. Endless improvisation. The line between meal and mud became very thin. Let's drift over to Ireland, centuries before the famous potato famine. Because medieval Ireland had its own recurring food crises long before tubers entered the picture. Tuki, Gaelic annals, those wonderfully grim records of medieval life, describe famine, years with quiet poetry. They write of the people eating herbs and roots of the earth, of the poor perishing by the roadside, and sometimes of great mortality, which is medieval shorthand for everyone starved. In coastal areas, people turned to the sea. They ate limpets, mussels, seaweed, anything the tide left behind. In fact, seaweed became such a crucial emergency food that later Irish folklore treated it almost like a holy substance. It was a gift from God when the land refused to give. So yes, famine diets could be grim, but they also created strange culinary traditions. Even today, you can find traditional dishes in parts of Northern Europe made from the same plants people once ate just to survive. History, as always, has a long memory for suffering and a surprisingly strong stomach. Now, you might be wondering, where were the rich during all this? Well, mostly indoors. The nobility, clergy, and well-connected merchants were insulated from the worst of it, though even they couldn't escape entirely. They had grain reserves, stored wine, salted meat. But famine wasn't just about lack of food. It was about the collapse of trade. When crops failed, prices soared. A loaf of bread that once cost a penny might suddenly cost 10. So even if food existed, most people couldn't afford it. And yes, nobles hoarded it, because of course they did. The church preached charity, and sometimes monasteries actually followed through, opening their granaries to feed the poor. Other times, they preferred to sell at inflated prices and call it divine providence. There's a story from Flanders, during one of the early 14th century famines, where a monastery distributed bread to the poor, and then charged them for the flour afterward. a fine example of Christian accounting. As hunger deepened, so did superstition. People began to look for someone to blame. They accused millers of hoarding grain, bakers of shrinking loaves, merchants of profiting from misery. And sometimes they were right, but often the blame fell on the usual suspects, witches, foreigners, or Jews, because nothing says we're starving quite like inventing a convenient scapegoat. Famines often triggered waves of persecution. It was easier to burn a heretic than admit you'd planned poorly for winter. And if the rain wouldn't stop, well, someone must have angered God. In this way, hunger fed fear, and fear fed cruelty. You can almost hear the echo of it centuries later in every moral panic that follows a disaster. But famine wasn't all despair. It also brought moments of strange generosity. Sometimes, wealthier villagers shared what little they had, because survival was collective. Some towns organized food kitchens long before the term existed, and occasionally, when the worst was over, people remembered those who'd helped them. After the Great Famine, new religious brotherhoods appeared across Europe, groups dedicated to feeding the poor in times of crisis. You could almost call it the medieval version of community resilience, a quiet rebellion against the randomness of nature. Even centuries later, peasants told stories of the hungry years. They remembered them as a kind of curse, passed down through memory. Parents warned children never to waste food, never to take full stomachs for granted, because somewhere, deep in their bones, they remembered what it felt like to scrape the last crumbs from a pot and call it dinner. The fire goes out, but the smoke remains. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world where fear was law, where a woman's silence could be called mysterious, her kindness suspicious, and her misfortune proof. A world where suspicion was a fire, and justice was a pile of ash at its center. Yes, tonight we're talking about witches, but not the ones who supposedly danced with the devil under a harvest moon, or cursed cows, or turned neighbors into toads. No, tonight we're looking at what happened after the fires, after the crowds went home, after the ashes cooled and the names were struck from the parish rolls. We're talking about the children left behind, because when the witch was gone, the story didn't end. For many, it was only beginning. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Let the world outside fade for a while. And let's drift together back into the half-forgotten silence that followed Europe's witch trials. Back to the lonely roads, the orphanages, and the whispered surnames that would follow certain children for generations. Let's start with something simple. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, Around 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe. The overwhelming majority were women, poor, widowed, or simply inconvenient. But almost every one of those women had a family, a husband who might now be ruined, a few children, suddenly without a mother, and a community that looked at them with the quiet unease people reserved for the contagious, because if witchcraft could run in families, and people very much believed it could, then the children were dangerous too. They had, in the minds of their neighbors, inherited the devil's blood, and so society decided to treat them accordingly. Let's begin in the German lands, because, naturally, Germany did witch hunts like they did beer festivals, thoroughly, frequently, and with remarkable local enthusiasm. In small towns along the Rhine, entire families could vanish within a season. A single accusation might spiral into dozens, and when the mothers were burned, their children were often an afterthought. Some were taken in by relatives, reluctantly. Others were turned out into the streets, marked by the same taint that had condemned their mothers. There are records from Würzburg and Bamberg, two cities that conducted some of the most notorious witch trials of the 17th century, showing groups of orphaned children being handed over to church-run homes. The notes beside their names often read, "Mother, executed for witchcraft," and that line followed them forever. In theory, the church was supposed to offer care and redemption. In practice, it offered discipline, labor, and silence. Children of witches grew up scrubbing convent floors, weaving for monasteries, or serving as unpaid help to the same priests who had presided over their mothers' trials. If they were lucky, they were merely pitied. If they weren't, they were watched. The stigma clung like smoke. Neighbors avoided them. Potential employers hesitated. And sometimes, when a crop failed or a cow died years later, the whispers began again. Because it was so much easier to believe that evil lingered in the blood than to accept that life was simply cruel and random. There are reports from Switzerland where the children of convicted witches were formally interrogated years after their mothers' deaths. Officials wanted to know if they knew the devil personally. Some of these children were as young as 7, and when frightened, children told stories, as frightened children often do. Their words became evidence. Sometimes they even became the next generation of trials, because nothing made witch hunters prouder than efficiency. Let's drift over to Scotland, a place where suspicion could freeze harder than the North Sea. Scottish witch trials were brutal, but also bureaucratic. They loved paperwork. For every woman accused, there was often a note about her household, her husband, her children, her known companions, and the children, once the trial was over, didn't simply go home. The church session records are full of chillingly bland phrases like, "The children are to be reared in fear of sin," which sounds wholesome enough until you realize that meant they were often removed from their homes and placed in strict religious oversight, sometimes indefinitely. Some were adopted by pious families, some were placed as servants to learn obedience, and some simply disappeared from the records, which, in early modern Scotland, usually meant death or destitution. Imagine being a 10-year-old, watching your mother taken away for questioning, and then, months later, hearing the church bell toll for her execution. Imagine walking through a village where every door closes as you pass, and knowing, even as you grow older, that no one will ever forget what your mother was. It's a peculiar cruelty of the time. They believed evil could be inherited, but mercy could not. Now, let's drift south to France, because the French, of course, managed to make witch trials bureaucratic and theatrical at the same time. In regions like Lorraine and Franche-Comté, witch hunts spread like summer wildfires. When the accused were executed, their families often had their property confiscated. The children were left penniless, sometimes even charged the costs of their mother's imprisonment, trial, and execution. Yes, you could lose your mother and receive a bill for it. Medieval economics at its finest. In a few cases, charitable orders stepped in to care for the children. But care in 17th century terms meant hard labor, religious correction, and very little affection. Some were trained as servants, some as field workers. A few were sent to monasteries, where the logic went something like, if the devil got your mother, perhaps God can get you first. It's not the kind of childhood one forgets easily. But let's talk about the men for a moment. The fathers left behind. Because when a woman was accused of witchcraft, her husband's life often collapsed with hers. He might be stripped of his property, his social standing, his friends. Even if he wasn't accused himself, few neighbors would risk being seen with him. And the children. Well, they became the visible reminder of his humiliation. Some fathers abandoned their children outright. Some fled towns where the gossip was too heavy to bear. And a few, crushed by despair or suspicion, ended up accused themselves. You can see the quiet domino effect of social fear. It didn't stop at the pyre. It rippled outward. Each burning cast a shadow over entire families, sometimes entire villages, for generations. Because once a family name was spoken in the same sentence as witch, it never quite washed off. Even a century later, local records sometimes referred to descendants as kin of the witch. The crime of one woman became a hereditary stain. Now, here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. Some children of accused witches grew up to become witch hunters themselves. It sounds like something out of tragic irony, and it was. The trauma of losing a parent to accusation sometimes turned inward. To survive, some children aligned themselves with the system that destroyed their families. They learned to speak its language of purity, repentance, vigilance. A few even worked as informants or witnesses in later trials. Historians have found cases of sons testifying against their mothers, often under pressure, and later growing into men who helped perpetuate the same fears. It's difficult to tell whether they believed it, or if it was the only way to survive. Because in a world where everyone feared the devil, denying your own contamination was a full-time job, but not every child broke under it. Some resisted in small, quiet ways. In parts of Scandinavia, where witch trials hit late and burned bright, there are records of children reclaiming their mothers' names decades later, petitioning local councils to have their families' property restored, or their reputations cleared. They didn't always succeed, but the act itself mattered. And in that quiet defiance, you can almost hear something human reasserting itself. A refusal to let history end at the pyre. Let's drift, for a moment, into what these children believed. Because here's the unsettling truth. Some of them did believe their mothers were witches. How could they not? They'd been told so by everyone, by priests, by neighbors, by the courts. They'd seen the confessions signed under torture, heard the rumors about secret Sabbaths and flying at night. And children, as every age knows, will believe almost anything if enough adults say it at once. So some grew up carrying both grief and shame. Mourning a mother, they were told, had consorted with Satan. It's a cruel emotional knot, to miss someone you've been taught to fear, and to wonder, quietly, whether their blood in your veins makes you damned too. That, more than anything, might be the lasting wound of the witch trials. Not just the deaths, but the stories they left behind. Stories whispered to children as truth. Of course, the Enlightenment eventually came along and ruined everyone's fun. By the mid-18th century, witch trials had largely faded. Skeptical lawyers and doctors began to point out that, statistically speaking, far more witches were poor widows than powerful sorceresses, and that maybe, just maybe, something else was going on. But the end of the trials didn't undo their legacy. In many rural communities, families with witch blood remained marked for generations. Old women who descended from the condemned were treated warily, avoided in markets, whispered about in taverns, even into the 19th century. You can find records of children being taunted in schoolyards, not for poverty or looks, but for ancestry. The hangman's hour. Hey everyone, tonight. We're drifting back to a time when justice was loud, bloody, and a bit of a public spectacle. a time when the smell of hot iron and old beer marked the center of town, when the word justice often meant the man with the axe, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, waiting for his cue. And that man, of course, was the executioner. He had a reputation. A necessary man in a world obsessed with punishment. And yet, a man nobody really wanted to talk to, or touch, or live next to, or marry. Unless, of course, you were another executioner's daughter. Then apparently that was fine. Tonight we're exploring what happened when the executioner wasn't, well, executing. Because that part of the job, the head chopping, the rope pulling, the limb removing, that didn't actually take up most of his week. The real story lies in what he did with the rest of his time. It's a strange little corner of medieval life, equal parts grotesque, sad, and absurd. So, settle in, dim the lights, forget the modern world for a bit, and let's drift back to the Middle Ages, to meet the men who kept law and order, one decapitation at a time. Let's start with something surprising. Executioners weren't usually monsters. They weren't sadists or bloodthirsty sociopaths lurking in black hoods. That image, the hood, the axe, the grim sneer, it's mostly a later invention. In reality, executioners were just men with a job, an unpleasant one, but someone had to do it. In early medieval towns, executions were often handled by whoever drew the short straw. Literally. Sometimes a soldier, sometimes a servant, sometimes a condemned man offered a pardon if he swung the sword right. Eventually, cities realized it might be more efficient to have someone do it properly. And so, the professional executioner was born, and from that point on, the poor man was doomed, because yes, he was paid, sometimes very well, but he was also shunned like a leper. He couldn't live inside the city walls. He couldn't buy bread from the baker, and heaven forbid he try to sit down for a pint at the local tavern, unless he wanted to be reminded, loudly, of exactly whose cousin he beheaded last week. Executioners existed in this bizarre paradox, essential but despised. They were hired by the city council, but banned from touching anything the townspeople might also touch. Needed for justice, but forever dirty because of it. It was, to put it mildly, an awkward position in society. So, naturally, they got creative about how to fill the time between executions. The line between folklore and memory never fully dissolved. It was a mirror that society held up to itself, and it didn't like what it saw. You might think the average hangman spent his off hours sharpening axes, tying ropes, and practicing his aim on unfortunate turnips. But in truth, most of them had second jobs, and quite often, those jobs were oddly respectable. See, because they were skilled with knives, and because no one else would associate with them, executioners often became butchers. They already had access to blades and a tolerance for gore, two useful qualities in the meat business. Some cities even required them to handle animal slaughter, as it was seen as similarly unclean work. In places like Germany, France, and Switzerland, the executioner's house doubled as the local abattoir. A man might execute a thief in the morning and sell pork chops to his neighbors in the afternoon, assuming, of course, his neighbors were willing to cross the street and buy from him, which many weren't. So, business could be slow. But the executioner's sideline didn't end there. He often worked as the city cleaner. That sounds innocuous. It wasn't. He was responsible for removing animal carcasses, human remains, and any other filth from the streets. Essentially, he was the medieval garbage collector, except the garbage occasionally had a name. The role came with some perks, though executioners could collect the clothes or belongings of the executed, sometimes selling them for profit. One can only imagine the delight of the townspeople buying a used coat, previously worn by a condemned thief, freshly washed of blood and guilt. Well, mostly washed, but perhaps the most surprising of all the executioner's side gigs was that he often worked as a healer, because medieval people, ever the masters of contradiction, believed that a man who dealt death could also somehow channel its opposite. They thought executioners had a strange, almost mystical connection to the body. After all, they knew anatomy better than anyone else in town, and they had access to things no ordinary doctor did, namely, bits and pieces of freshly deceased people. So the same hand that swung the sword might also apply a poultice, set a broken bone, or offer a cure made from the fat of hanged men. I wish I were exaggerating. It was common in parts of Germany and France for executioners to run small apothecaries, selling salves and potions. The fat of the executed, melted down and mixed with herbs, was said to cure gout, joint pain, or epilepsy. Blood from the scaffold was considered a cure for the falling sickness. Even the rope used in hangings was prized as a charm against misfortune. So yes, the medieval executioner wasn't just your local bringer of death. He was also, bizarrely, your local pharmacist. Let's drift, for a moment, to 16th century Nuremberg, a city that produced one of the most famous executioners in European history, Franz Schmidt. He's a rare case because he actually kept a diary of his work, which, when you think about it, is both horrifying and endearingly bureaucratic. Schmidt recorded every person he executed, 394 of them, along with the details of each death. But what's fascinating isn't just his professionalism, it's what he did when he wasn't killing people. Schmidt was, in many ways, the model of respectability. He saw his work as a solemn duty, not a pleasure. He tried to live quietly, maintain his dignity, and even dress well, which was quite a feat considering most townspeople wouldn't shake his hand. In his downtime, he became a respected medical practitioner. People came to his house for treatments. He set bones, drained abscesses, and prescribed herbal cures. By the end of his life, he was so well regarded that he received official permission to retire as a gentleman. Quite the promotion from that man who kills people on Thursdays. Of course, not every executioner achieved such an elegant outcome. Many lived hard, lonely lives on the margins of their towns, in literal and social exile. In most places, the executioner and his family were forced to live outside the city gates, often in a small house near the gallows or the dump. Their children were forbidden to play with others. They married within their own small circle of outcasts. Other executioner families, knackers and tanners. Generation after generation, the profession became hereditary. A grim family business, passed from father to son. Imagine growing up knowing your future career was already chosen for you. Anti-want, and that it involved either chopping off heads or boiling down horse carcasses. It was not, to put it mildly, the most inspiring childhood. But this isolation had its advantages. Executioner. Families became close-knit communities. They developed their own hierarchies and networks. A son might apprentice under his father, then travel to another town to take up the same role. Sometimes, entire dynasties of hangmen existed, tracing their lineage like nobility, but with more stains on the carpet. And what about their reputation? It varied wildly. Some were feared and hated, drunken, corrupt, and brutal. Others, like Franz Schmidt, were respected for their restraint and professionalism. In some towns, the executioner even acted as an informal police officer, handling interrogations or torture sessions, because, of course, who better to supervise pain than the man who'd perfected it? He was, in short, the man everyone wanted around when things got ugly. But nobody wanted around the rest of the time. It's a kind of medieval irony. They were indispensable, yet invisible, like plumbers of human morality. Let's drift a bit further, to the small details. Because the executioner's day-to-day life was full of strange, quiet contradictions. He might spend his morning cleaning his sword, which had to be spotless and sharp enough to cleave a neck in one blow. Then, in the afternoon, he'd be called to remove a strayed dog carcass from the market square. He'd go home to eat dinner alone with his family, while the town bells rang for vespers. Bells he wasn't allowed to touch, because his touch was considered polluting. Even his home was marked. Visitors avoided it. Children threw stones at the door, and yet, every so often, someone would sneak by at night, desperate for a cure, or a question answered, or perhaps to buy a charm from the gallows rope. The same man they'd spit at in the street during the day was their healer by moonlight. All of this gave executioners a strange sort of power. They lived on society's edge, but from that vantage point, they could see everyone's secrets. They knew which noble's son was caught stealing, which merchant was smuggling, which priest had bribed the magistrate. Everyone wanted them gone, but nobody wanted to offend them too much, just in case. There are stories of townspeople sending food quietly to the executioner's family on feast days, or slipping them coins after an especially clean execution. A silent, uneasy gratitude, because in the end, someone had to do the job, and it was better to have a professional do it, cleanly, swiftly, and with a touch of dignity, than to risk a botched beheading in the town square. No one liked the executioner, but everyone preferred him to the alternative, the sound of bells and the smell of cabbage. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back about 900 years to a world that hummed with the low tolling of bells, the faint scent of incense, and the very real smell of unwashed wool. So, settle in, dim the lights, maybe have some tea, ideally not the kind steeped in medieval water, because that would end poorly. And let's drift into the cloistered, slightly uncomfortable calm of the Middle Ages. Our question tonight is simple. Did anyone actually enjoy living in a medieval monastery? The short answer is, some did, briefly, before dying of dysentery. But we'll take our time getting there, because monasteries were more than religious buildings. They were the Wi-Fi hubs of the medieval world, centers of learning, production, and gossip. If something important was written down between 500 and 1500 AD, odds are it was copied by a monk who hadn't spoken out loud in 17 years and was quietly judging whoever came up with the word onomatopoeia. But to understand whether anyone enjoyed this life, we have to start with what it was. The Shape of Silence picture. A monastery. Not the romantic movie version. No soft Gregorian background track yet. But the real one. Damp, echoing stone, small windows, air so cold it could bruise your soul. The walls were thick, both for defense and because medieval architects had the subtlety of a large loaf of bread. Inside, life was built around the rule, most famously the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century by a man who had once lived in a cave and decided everyone else should join him in spirit. Benedict's rule was a kind of medieval employee handbook. It outlined when monks should pray, eat, sleep, confess, and, ideally, not complain. Spoiler: they complained anyway. The day was divided by bells, 8 prayer services from the bleary-eyed matins before dawn to Compline, the final one before bed. The bells ruled everything. You didn't wake when you wanted to. You woke when the bell said so. You didn't eat when hungry. You ate when the bell said so. You didn't use the latrine. Yes, there were communal latrines, unless the schedule allowed it. It was spiritual life by alarm clock, and yet there was something deeply appealing about this to many medieval people. The world outside the cloister was loud, dirty, and constantly on fire. Inside, there was order, predictability, and an endless supply of porridge. Recruitment, or how to accidentally become a monk. So, how did one end up there? Well, some joined voluntarily, especially those seeking peace, education, or an escape from their family. Others had help. Rich families often donated their less promising children to the church. Not out of cruelty, of course. Oh, no. It was about spiritual investment. One son to pray for the souls of the rest, sort of like eternal insurance coverage. So if you were a quiet, bookish 12-year-old from a noble family, your parents might kiss you on the forehead, hand you a set of sandals, and say, "Congratulations. You now live with 40 celibate men and a goose named Benedict." There were also oblates, children given to monasteries at a young age to be raised as monks. Some were as young as 5. They learned to read, to chant, to sow their own habits, and to suppress any emotion that wasn't quiet resignation. Did they enjoy it? Hard to say. But they wrote some beautiful marginal doodles, which will count as a small cry for help. The daily grind lets drift through a typical day. The first bell rings around 2 a.m. The monks shuffle in. Darkness to the chapel for matins, night prayers. Imagine standing barefoot on cold stone, chanting psalms in Latin while your stomach quietly negotiates a truce with last night's lentils. Then, maybe, a short nap. Maybe not. At sunrise, lauds. Then work. Then more prayer. Then breakfast, which was usually bread, sometimes cheese, and on particularly wild mornings, beans. Work varied by monastery. Some cultivated fields, others copied manuscripts, others brewed beer, one of the few safe liquids available. In fact, medieval beer was often weak and consumed like water. It was called small beer, and monks drank it by the gallon. The average monk might consume 4 to 5 liters per day because the medieval approach to hydration was stay slightly drunk, stay alive. By late morning, more prayer, then the main meal. Meat was officially banned in many orders, except for the sick, which, conveniently, meant that quite a few monks were perpetually unwell. The infirmary became the happiest place on the property, a kind of medieval loophole buffet. After lunch, a brief rest, more work, more prayer, and eventually vespers at sunset. The day closed with compline, a final chant to end the cycle. Then silence. Always silence. The rule limited speech to essentials. A monk might pass his brother in the corridor and simply nod. Or, if feeling particularly talkative, mime a fish to indicate it's Friday. We're fasting. Entire monastic sign languages developed this way, just so they could express the vital thought. Pass the butter. A different kind of luxury now. Here's the thing. Despite all this deprivation, monastic life could be comfortable, at least by medieval standards. Monasteries were some of the few places with consistent food, protection, and literacy. During famines or wars, peasants envied them. Many abbots, especially in large Benedictine houses like Cluny, lived surprisingly well. They had fine robes, silver tableware, and sometimes private quarters. One abbot in 13th century France was chastised for owning a fur-lined cloak. He defended himself by saying he needed it for his delicate constitution, which is medieval for, I like being cozy. But of course, the richer the monastery became, the less anyone there resembled the humble monks of Benedict's ideal. There were scandals. Monks hoarding money, running vineyards, keeping pets, sneaking out to socialize. At one point, Cistercian reformers accused Cluniac monks of turning worship into musical theater. And to be fair, they did have very elaborate choirs. Imagine a bunch of solemn men arguing over whether their liturgical harmony was too jazzy for God. The women. Behind the walls, we can't drift past the nuns. Women's monastic life was parallel, though often poorer and stricter. Nunneries were sometimes refuges for widows, unwanted daughters, or those seeking education. And though they followed similar rules, convents were frequently underfunded and overwatched by male clergy. But some were remarkable centers of culture. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, 12th century abbess, composer, mystic, medical writer, and all-around overachiever, basically ran her community like a medieval TED Talk circuit. She claimed to receive visions directly from God, which conveniently gave her an unchallengeable management style. Did she enjoy monastic life? In her letters, she sounded busy, but fulfilled, which is about as close to enjoyment as one got in the 1100s. Most nuns, though, lived in simple, repetitive quiet, days filled with spinning, praying, and trying not to freeze to death. Their correspondence reveals occasional moments of joy, the beauty of a sunrise, the comfort of shared work, the humor of a chicken that refused to behave. Small things, the kind that make endurance feel sacred. When silence gets weird. Prolonged silence does odd things to the human mind. Monks occasionally reported hearing divine voices, or demonic ones. Some became mystics, others just mildly paranoid. A few, in moments of weakness, confessed to talking to the monastery's cats, which is entirely understandable. And the rule's silence wasn't absolute. Reading aloud was encouraged, but only sacred texts. So, while they couldn't discuss last night's dream, They could chant the Psalms at 4 a.m. for the 1,000th time, which might explain some of the hallucinations. That said, monks also developed a wry, almost subversive humor. Marginal drawings in manuscripts, doodled during hours of copying, show snails jousting knights, rabbits chasing hunters, and other absurd scenes. That's centuries of pent-up mischief, quietly released through ink, illness, hygiene, and other joys now. We can't pretend monastic life was comfortable in a physical sense. Hygiene was variable. Monks were encouraged to bathe occasionally, but not for pleasure. Benedict wrote that baths should be taken when necessary, which, in medieval terms, meant when you smell like penance itself. Clothing was coarse wool, feet often bare. Winters were brutal. The latrines were communal, long stone benches with holes and running water underneath, which was advanced for the time, but still not the spa experience one might hope for. And yet, there was a curious resilience to it. Monks genuinely believed their discomfort purified the soul. Suffering was a form of devotion, a daily offering to God through chapped skin and chilblains. Some even pushed this to extremes. The anchorites, for instance, religious hermits who literally walled themselves into small cells attached to churches. They took vows never to leave, subsisting on bread, water, and occasional visitors who passed food through a window. An English woman named Julian of Norwich did this in the 14th century, then wrote Revelations of Divine Love, the first known book in English by a woman. So yes, she achieved enlightenment, but also she lived in a tiny stone box for decades. A complicated trade-off. So, back to our question. Did anyone actually enjoy this? The discipline gave them purpose. The community, though rigid, offered belonging. The prayers gave rhythm to their days. A constant, slow heartbeat in a chaotic world. Many monks wrote about peace, about the joy of contemplation, about feeling close to God amid the chanting and candlelight. The quiet. After the thrones, hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back through a strange corner of history. One that tends to make people pause for a moment and then quietly say, wait, what happened to them? We're talking about eunuchs, the men without heirs, without families, and often without a choice, who rose to astonishing heights of power in empires that no longer exist. They ran palaces. They commanded armies. They whispered into the ears of emperors and queens. And then, when those empires fell, they vanished, not dramatically, not with a final battle or a glorious farewell, just gone. It's the story of what happens when the most indispensable men in the world lose the world itself. Let's drift onward. But of course, monasteries weren't frozen in time. Over the centuries, they changed. Some flourished into wealthy estates. Others decayed into ghostly ruins. The Reformation, centuries later, would sweep many away entirely. But before that came an era of luxury, decline, and a few truly spectacular scandals. Because whenever you lock humans together under vows of chastity, poverty, and silence, something always goes wrong. Tonight we're tracing the quiet after the thrones, the long twilight of the eunuchs. Let's start somewhere vast, marble, and suspiciously quiet. The Byzantine Empire. For nearly 1,000 years, Byzantium ran on bureaucracy, gold, and gossip, and at the heart of it all were the eunuchs. They were the imperial administrators, the secretaries, chamberlains, and diplomats who handled the empire's most delicate tasks. They could be trusted. The logic went because they had no family to advance, no sons to inherit power, no ambitions outside the palace walls, which, naturally, made them the most ambitious men alive. Some became generals, others became saints. A few became so powerful that emperors slept uneasily, knowing a eunuch held the palace keys. But eventually, in 1453, the city of Constantinople fell. The Ottomans stormed the gates, and centuries of Byzantine hierarchy went up in smoke. So what happened to the eunuchs then? Some were killed in the siege, defending the city with the same grim loyalty they'd shown to every emperor before. Others were taken captive, absorbed into the Ottoman system, which conveniently also employed eunuchs in abundance. But most simply, Martin's phone disappeared into history. The Byzantine records go quiet. Their names vanish from the rolls, and the last imperial eunuch, whoever he was, likely died in obscurity, in a small monastery or a corner of some forgotten estate, surrounded not by courtiers, but by silence. Imagine that. A man who once controlled the emperor's household, now tending a small garden somewhere, listening to the distant echo of a vanished empire. That's the tone of this story. The strange half-life that followed the great courts of castrated power. Because Byzantium wasn't unique. The Ottoman Empire, Persia, China, India. Almost every major imperial system found some use for eunuchs. They were considered ideal servants, loyal, discreet, and unable to start dynasties of their own, which is one of those ideas that sounds tidy in theory and goes horribly wrong in practice. Because when you take away every avenue of personal ambition except the state, the result is someone terrifyingly good at politics. Eunuchs learned to survive not just within systems, but through them. They endured the fall of rulers, the collapse of dynasties, and the constant suspicion that came with being indispensable. Until, finally, the systems themselves fell, and with them, the strange, delicate ecosystem that had allowed eunuchs to exist at all. Let's drift east now, to Beijing, sometime in the 15th century. The Forbidden City was at its height, a labyrinth of red walls, gold roofs, and endless protocol, and it was crawling with eunuchs. Thousands of them. They polished the emperor's sandals, recorded his dreams, handled his correspondence, managed his meals, and occasionally spied on his wives. They were everywhere and nowhere, essential but invisible. By the late Ming Dynasty, they practically ran the empire. Some were poets, some were philosophers, and some, like the famous Admiral Zheng He, commanded entire fleets. Zheng He, the Muslim eunuch who sailed all the way to East Africa in the early 1400s, became a legend. 7 voyages, enormous ships, gifts of silk and porcelain to kings who had never heard of China before. And then, almost as soon as he died, his fleet was burned, his records erased, and his achievements dismissed as inconvenient. Because that's the eunuch's curse. They could shape empires, but they could never inherit them. When the Ming Dynasty finally collapsed in 1644, the eunuchs were among the first to go. They were blamed for corruption, decadence, and all the usual things bureaucrats get blamed for when an empire falls apart. The new Qing rulers, wary of their influence, drastically reduced their numbers. Few clung to ceremonial posts, the caretakers of empty halls. Others were expelled into a city that no longer needed them. One observer in the 19th century described a handful of elderly eunuchs living in Beijing's back alleys, making a living by selling small trinkets or telling ghost stories about the Forbidden City. Men who had once served emperors, now selling cheap incense to tourists. It's almost too poetic, if it weren't so quietly tragic. And then, of course, there were the Ottomans. If Byzantium perfected the bureaucratic eunuch, and China perfected the imperial eunuch, the Ottomans perfected the palace eunuch. At the center of it all stood the Kuzlar-A, the chief black eunuch. He was, quite literally, one of the most powerful men in the Islamic world. He controlled the imperial harem, which wasn't the scandalous fantasy Europeans imagined, but rather a tightly run domestic and political system. He oversaw the education of royal women, managed access to the Sultan, and handled immense wealth through charitable endowments. And he was almost always an African eunuch, taken as a boy from Sudan or Ethiopia, castrated and trained for palace service. It's an unsettling history, and yet, within that cruel system, some of these men rose to incredible influence. They became power brokers, scholars, and patrons of art. They commissioned mosques. They sent letters to the Pope. They played the game better than most of the men who had full claim to masculinity. But empires don't last. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman world was crumbling. Reforms modernized the army, the courts, the bureaucracy, and left the palace eunuchs stranded in a world that no longer needed them. Their authority eroded quietly. No dramatic rebellion, no purge, just fewer duties, fewer rooms to guard, fewer people to impress. By the time the empire officially ended in 1922, there were only a few dozen eunuchs left in the entire palace. When the new Turkish Republic turned the Topkapi Palace into a museum, they became part of the exhibit. Relics in human form. The last known Ottoman eunuch, a man named Tahsin Ağa, lived into the 1960s. He died in a small Istanbul apartment, long after the sultans and concubines were gone. It's said he still kept a photograph of the old palace on his wall, the last home where he'd mattered. Across centuries, across continents, the pattern repeats. Eunuchs rose in systems obsessed with control. When those systems vanished, they dissolved too, like salt in water. Because what do you do with a life built entirely around proximity to power, when the power itself disappears? They didn't have families to retreat to. They didn't have land or legacy. They weren't even supposed to exist outside the palace walls. So most didn't. A few joined monasteries. Some became caretakers of the ruins they once ruled, and others simply faded into local legend, whispered about by villagers as the old palace man. Chauve were living ghosts of vanished empires. And yet, there's a strange kind of peace in their endings. Most of history's powerful men died violently. Kings, generals, ministers, all devoured by the politics they served. The eunuchs, though, they tended to die quietly, not glorious, not tragic, just quietly, which, in its own way, is a sort of victory. They'd spent lifetimes navigating the whims of emperors, the jealousy of princes, and the suspicion of priests, and somehow they outlived them all. The last Byzantine eunuch, the last Ming eunuch, the last Ottoman eunuch, each one a faint echo of an empire that believed it could control everything, even the human body. There's one haunting little note from 1912, when the Chinese imperial court finally fell. The Forbidden City became a half-empty shell, with only a few hundred eunuchs left to care for the exiled boy emperor, Puyi. They stayed out of loyalty, or maybe habit. They swept the courtyards, lit the incense, and tended the relics of a vanished age. When Puyi was expelled in 1924, many of them were turned out onto the streets. One of them, a man named Sun Yaoting, later gave an interview. He said, "When I was young, I served the Son of Heaven. Now I mend shoes. He was the last eunuch of China. He died in 1996, a living bridge between imperial grandeur and the neon glare of modernity, and no one like him would ever exist again. So, as we rest here at the edge of empires, let's take a quiet moment to imagine them. The forgotten ones. The men who lived in silence, served in shadows, and disappeared without legacy. History rarely remembers them by name, but they were everywhere, behind every throne, every silk curtain, every signed decree. The empire falls. The marble cracks. The echoes fade. And somewhere, in a dusty back room, a man who once ran the world puts down his broom and closes the door for the last time. How to convince a village you found. God, hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world lit only by candlelight, and occasionally by the faint, miraculous glow of something that was probably on fire. A world where people prayed for rain, feared comets, and saw the hand of God in everything from plagues to oddly shaped turnips. We're heading back to the Middle Ages, and tonight's question is a fun one, or at least fun in the strange medieval sense of the word. How did people fake miracles in the Middle Ages? Because, and you may want to settle into your pillow for this, quite a few of them were faked. Some by desperate monks trying to save their abbey from bankruptcy. Some by clever priests who realized a little divine marketing could go a long way, and some by royal officials who discovered that a timely miracle could do wonders for politics. So, get comfortable. Maybe light a candle of your own. And let's drift back to a time when belief could move mountains, or at least make a statue cry on command. Let's begin with a simple truth. The medieval world was aching for miracles. Life was brutal. Wars came and went. Famine lingered. Medicine was experimental in the worst way. If your child recovered from fever, it was God's mercy. If he didn't, it was God's will. Faith wasn't optional. It was survival. And in a society built on that kind of desperation, miracles were the emotional currency of the age. The church needed them to prove divine favor. Kings needed them to prove legitimacy, and ordinary people needed them just to get through another cold winter, without asking too many questions. But there was a problem. Genuine miracles were rare, and demand was very high. So, naturally, human creativity stepped in. The first and simplest kind of miracle was the weeping statue. These were wildly popular. Nothing thrilled a medieval congregation like seeing the Virgin Mary cry real tears, preferably while they were in the audience. Of course, There were a few ways to help the divine along. Artisans learned to hollow out statues, drill tiny holes around the eyes, and fill the cavity with water, wine, or, if someone wanted to make an impression, pig's blood. At the right moment, usually during Mass or a pilgrimage, a discreet tap from behind would release the liquid. The crowd gasped. Bells rang. Coins clinked into the donation box. Miracle achieved. One bishop's report from the 14th century describes a bleeding crucifix that turned out to contain a bladder filled with the juice of pigs, which is medieval speak for someone built a blood balloon inside Jesus. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Not all miracles were quite so hydraulic. Some used heat instead. A few enterprising monks discovered that a bit of wax placed behind a statue's eyes could melt under candlelight, producing perfect, slow, glistening tears. It was a very subtle trick, the kind that left even educated visitors whispering. Of course, sometimes the timing went wrong. One German abbey in the 1200s reported that their virgin wept continually for 3 days, until someone realized the poor thing had been placed too close to the fireplace. Divine sorrow, or just bad temperature control. Then there were relics, the miracle makers you could actually carry around. If a monastery had the finger of a saint, or his tooth, or ideally a splinter from something Jesus once touched, it was guaranteed pilgrims for life. And pilgrims brought money, food, and fame, so the trade in relics exploded. By the 13th century, Europe was absolutely riddled with sacred body parts. There were, by some estimates, enough fragments of the true cross to build a modest wooden chapel. 4 complete skulls of John the Baptist circulated simultaneously, and one church in France claimed to possess a feather from the Archangel Gabriel, which, given that angels are not typically known for molting, is a bold claim. To modern ears, this sounds absurd, but to medieval minds, it was perfectly plausible. And if it brought a few hundred pilgrims a year to your remote monastery, who was going to ask too many questions? Behind all of this were what we might now call miracle technicians, the quiet, practical craftsmen of the faith industry. These were the monks who brewed colored liquids to simulate blood, the goldsmiths who rigged relics to sparkle under candlelight, the masons who built altars with secret compartments for smoke or flame. One recipe for holy fire, found in a 15th century alchemical text, is suspiciously close to that of simple phosphorus paste, which glows blue in darkness. And in an age where most people had mirrors or proper light, a glowing relic could seem utterly supernatural. It wasn't deceit so much as stagecraft, part faith, part theater. Still, not every miracle was made in a workshop. Sometimes they were natural accidents that got promoted. For instance, if rainwater dripped onto a church statue in a way that looked like tears, word spread quickly. By the time anyone checked for roof leaks, a full pilgrimage might already be underway. Likewise, if a tomb smelled faintly sweet, probably due to embalming herbs, it was taken as proof of sanctity. A decaying corpse reeking of roses was considered holy. A decaying corpse reeking of, well, corpse, was less impressive. Medieval sainthood was heavily odor-based. Let's drift to one of the best documented medieval hoaxes, the bleeding host of Will Snack. In 1383, a small German village claimed to possess 3 communion wafers that bled real blood when desecrated. Almost overnight, Will Snack became one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in Europe. Tens of thousands of visitors arrived. The town got rich. New inns, new shops, new everything. Then the church investigated and discovered the wafers had been tinted, possibly with animal blood. The bishops denounced it as fraud. The locals shrugged and kept selling souvenirs, because by then the miracle had become real in the only way that mattered. It made people believe. Now, it's tempting to imagine the Middle Ages as gullible. But the truth is, even back then, people suspected. Chroniclers wrote about false wonders with a mixture of amusement and irritation. Educated clergy were skeptical, and some bishops made a career out of debunking them. One 14th century inspector complained that monks in his district were ever devising novelties of faith for profit, which is a very polite way of saying, stop making Jesus leak things for cash. Still, those same bishops weren't entirely innocent, because sometimes a convenient miracle served a purpose too. Which brings us to the royal and political side of miracle-making, what we might call state-sponsored sanctity. If a king wanted to prove divine favor, nothing helped like a public miracle. Cross glowing before battle. A relic curing the king's disease. Royal saint working wonders from beyond the grave. One of the most famous examples is Edward the Confessor, King of England. During his lifetime, Edward was known mostly for being gentle, indecisive, and possibly allergic to decision-making in general. But after his death, the Church, with strong royal encouragement, declared him a saint. Suddenly, stories appeared of his healing touch, his visions, and his perfect chastity, which is impressive, considering his marriage had been almost entirely chaste for political reasons. His canonization helped legitimize later kings, because if England's royal line descended from a saint, then clearly their wars and taxes were divinely approved. The heavenly PR machine was already running smoothly by the 12th century. Meanwhile, in France, the monarchy developed its own miracle, the royal touch. It was believed that kings could heal a disease called scrofula, a kind of tuberculosis of the lymph nodes, simply by laying hands on the patient and murmuring a prayer. Thousands of sufferers lined up to be touched. Some claimed to recover, others didn't, but were very polite about it. The ritual continued for centuries, long after anyone believed it worked. Kings did it not because they thought they were magical, but because not doing it looked bad. Louis XIV, the Sun King, personally touched over 200,000 people during his reign, which is both impressive and deeply unhygienic. But to his subjects, it proved the divine bond between king and people, a living, breathing miracle of monarchy, even if it mostly spread germs. Let's drift for a moment to the quieter side of this. The personal miracle seekers. Ordinary men and women who desperately wanted proof that heaven noticed them. Many of the fakers weren't greedy. They were lonely. A humble nun might claim a vision, not for fame, but because she needed her suffering to mean something. A hermit might pretend his wounds matched Christ's, not for profit, but for belonging. Faith and fraud blurred in strange human ways, and the Church, though often stern, sometimes allowed the line to stay fuzzy, because whether or not the miracle was real, the devotion was, and devotion kept the whole fragile system together. Of course, not every faker got away with it. The Church could be surprisingly thorough when it wanted to. Suspect visionaries were interrogated. Relics were tested. And in some cases, miracle fraud could lead to exile or execution. There's a record from the 15th century of a woman in Burgundy who claimed her wounds bled miraculously every Friday. A skeptical priest watched her carefully and discovered she'd been pricking herself with a small needle during prayer. She was sentenced to public penance, not for bleeding, but for doing it on purpose. There's a fine line between faith and performance art, and she had, unfortunately, crossed it. The man behind the axe, "Hey everyone." Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when death had a job title. So, if you're lying in bed, lights low. Maybe your tea's gone just slightly cold. Perfect. Let's talk about medieval executioners. Those mysterious figures who step out of the shadows in old woodcuts and morality plays, usually holding an axe or a sword, or something pointy enough to remind us of our own mortality. But we're not here to watch anyone lose their head tonight. We're here for something much quieter. What happened after the crowd went home? The scaffold was cleaned, and the man in the hood walked back to his house. If he even had one. What did he do on his day off? Did he sit by the fire and sip ale? Did he chat with his neighbors, if they'd let him? Did he worry about the stain that wouldn't come out of his tunic, or whether the city would pay him on time for his most recent hanging? That's what we're going to explore tonight. Not the execution itself, but the strange, lonely, oddly bureaucratic life of the people who carried them out. because despite what the stories say, they weren't all mysterious, nameless monsters. Most were ordinary men, trapped in an extraordinary line of work. Let's start by taking a slow, foggy walk through a medieval town. Imagine narrow cobblestone streets, slick with rain, the faint smell of tallow candles, and a few brave souls hurrying home before curfew. Somewhere, a bell tolls the hour. At the edge of town, not in it, mind you, stands a small wooden house. Smoke curls out of the chimney. That's where the executioner lives. You'd think someone who did such grim work might live in luxury, but usually it was quite the opposite. Executioners were well paid, yes, sometimes very well paid. But they were also social outcasts. Their profession was considered unclean. They were technically essential to justice, but morally tainted by it. In other words, everyone wanted them around, but no one wanted to be around them. And so, towns often built their homes outside the walls, near the gallows or the dump, because, apparently, zoning laws were a thing even in the 14th century. Inside, life was surprisingly ordinary. The executioner might be sitting by the fire with his wife. Yes, most were married, patching his tools, sharpening blades, and trying not to think too hard about his reputation. He might have a few children running around, who would, unfortunately, inherit not only his name, but his social stigma. In many places, the job passed down like a curse, father to son, generation after generation. Because once you were in that line of work, no one else would hire you. In Germany, especially, the position became hereditary. Whole families became dynasties of death. The most famous of them all was probably the Franz Schmidt family of Nuremberg, who, as far as executioners go, were considered model citizens. But we'll get to him later. For now, let's linger on the quieter, sadder ones. The men who didn't have a tidy diary or civic respect, or a nice pension from the city council. You see, the medieval executioner didn't only execute people. That would be too simple. He was, essentially, the town's all-purpose remover of unwanted things. He dealt with corpses, animal carcasses, sewage, disease, and whatever else decent folk preferred not to touch. If a stray dog became rabid, he'd handle it. If the market had too many beggars hanging around, he'd clear them. If there was a mysterious body floating down the river, well, someone had to fish it out. He was both the city's cleaner and its conscience, although no one ever thanked him for either. And yet, on paper, executioners were civil servants. They were appointed, salaried, and sometimes even unionized in their own bleak way. In many towns, they received official uniforms and budgets for equipment maintenance. That's the polite way of saying new ropes, new blades, and occasionally new saws. But beyond the paperwork, they were social ghosts. No one wanted to shake their hand. Literally, the executioner's touch was thought to bring bad luck. Children were told not to look them in the eye. Priests hesitated to give them communion. It's hard to make friends under those conditions, so most executioners kept to themselves, retreating to small gardens, pets, hobbies, and the occasional drink. Some became surprisingly good at other trades. A few even became healers. Yes, You heard that right. The man who took lives by day often tried to save them by night. It sounds paradoxical, but it makes sense. Executioners understood anatomy better than anyone else, for reasons we don't need to linger on too graphically. They knew how much blood a body could lose before death, where the bones joined, how muscles tore. It wasn't exactly medical school, but it was practical experience. So many offered services as bone setters or herbalists. People came to them secretly, especially the poor, who couldn't afford licensed physicians, and, ironically, the same hand that ended life on the scaffold might be the one that healed a broken arm or set a dislocated shoulder. It's one of those odd historical ironies that feels almost poetic. Society condemned them for taking life, but quietly relied on them to preserve it. Of course, that didn't make them popular. The town might appreciate their healing skills, but they still weren't invited to feasts or christenings. Imagine being the man who fixed everyone's bones, but wasn't allowed to sit next to them at the tavern. That was the life of an executioner. Now, let's drift for a moment to the morning after an execution. The crowd has dispersed. The wooden scaffold creaks in the wind. Maybe a few ravens circle overhead, doing what ravens do best. Our executioner packs up his tools, the sword carefully wiped, the rope coiled neatly. He walks home slowly, probably exhausted, maybe thinking about whether he did the job cleanly enough to avoid complaints. Because yes, people did complain. Executions were public spectacles. If he swung poorly or missed his mark, the crowd booed, and the city council might fine him for unprofessional conduct. Imagine being publicly reviewed for your job performance by a crowd of thousands. Medieval Yelp was unforgiving. So, on his day off, he might practice. In some places, executioners rehearsed with pigs. Same approximate neck thickness, as grim as that sounds, to make sure their technique was perfect. There was even a strange pride in their craft. Some used fine, decorated swords, engraved with prayers or family crests. A few kept ledgers, noting each sentence carried out with the precision of an accountant. In their minds, they weren't butchers. They were professionals ensuring that justice was swift, humane, and clean. That's how many justified it to themselves. But not everyone chose the profession willingly. Some were forced into it as punishment. If a man committed a crime but was spared execution, he might be offered a choice. Take the job of the previous executioner, who'd just been executed himself, or die. A grim little cycle of occupational inheritance. Others were outsiders, foreigners, or men of impure ancestry, which is medieval code for anyone local society didn't particularly like. So even on their supposed days off, they lived under the same unspoken rule: stay out of sight. Many spent time tending small gardens, brewing their own ale or raising animals. It's not hard to imagine them finding quiet comfort in routine, pulling weeds, sharpening a hoe instead of a blade, feeding chickens who, thankfully, never judged them. Some became local legends. There are accounts of towns where the executioner was the only one brave enough to tend to plague victims when everyone else fled. The same man shunned as unclean became briefly the town's most essential citizen. And when the danger passed, he went right back to being uninvited to church. History has a cruel sense of irony like that. Now, if you're wondering whether executioners ever liked their jobs, the answer is complicated. Some clearly did. Not in the gleeful, villainous way movies suggest, but in a prideful, craftsman-like sense. They believed they were performing a sacred duty. Others hated it, and their letters, the few that survive, read like cries of exhaustion. One wrote that his dreams were haunted by the faces of the condemned. Another said he prayed every night that no new sentence would come. But either way, they kept doing it. Because, as far as society was concerned, someone had to. And better it be a professional than an amateur. The alternative was chaos. Mob executions, lynchings, half-trained guards botching the job. The executioner, for all his unpopularity, represented civilization's dark compromise, the idea that justice required someone to get their hands dirty. So he did. And then he went home, washed them as best he could, and tried to forget. Let's drift over now to Nuremberg, around the late 1500s, where one particular executioner decided to do something unusual. He kept a diary. His name was Franz Schmidt, and he's one of the few men who let us see this world from the inside. Not as a monster, but as a weary bureaucrat of death. He served for 45 years, executed 394 people, and recorded every single one of them in meticulous, almost tender handwriting, but he also noted the little details: who confessed, who wept, who held their dignity to the end. He described his patients, too, because in his spare time he treated the sick and injured of Nuremberg. Over 15,000 of them, apparently. He was a man who both took life and gave it back. When he retired, the city actually thanked him, gave him citizenship, an almost unheard-of gesture. So yes, sometimes, very rarely, the executioner got his redemption.